On a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air carries a hint of nostalgia and the city buzzes with quiet determination, Judge Alan Whitman stepped into his courtroom. The walls were adorned with sullen portraits of long-past judges, their gazes heavy with the weight of justice. Alan, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor that commanded both respect and authority, adjusted his robes as he prepared for another day of hearings. For him, the courtroom was his domain, a place where the rule of law was absolute and personal feelings were left at the door. At least, that's how it was supposed to be. Today's docket was full, but it was one case in particular that would test every principle Alan thought he stood for. The doors to the courtroom creaked open, and in walked a woman who exuded a quiet confidence. Dressed modestly, but with a sharpness that suggested she was no stranger to standing her ground, Maya Bennett carried an air of resilience. Her dark eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on Alan before she approached the defendant's table. Her poise was undeniable, but there was something else, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air the moment their eyes met. Alan's heart skipped, but he quickly masked his reaction. Asterisk, no, asterisk, he thought, shaking off the wave of familiarity. Asterisk it couldn't be her asterisk. Maya, for her part, showed no outward sign of recognition, though her mind was racing. The man sitting on the elevated bench was unmistakable. Age had added lines to his face, and his hair was no longer the deep chestnut she remembered. There was no denying it. This was Alan Whitman. The same Alan who, years ago, had been her fiercest rival on the debate stage. The Alan who had stood toe-to-toe with her during those intense college competitions, both of them determined to outwit the other. Back then, their rivalry was the stuff of campus legend. But that was a lifetime ago, and now, here they were on opposite sides of the gavel. The case was a minor infraction on paper, a parking violation that had spiraled into something more when Maya contested it, citing a procedural error. Most people would have paid the fine and moved on, but Maya wasn't most people. She believed in principles and standing up for what was right, no matter how small the issue seemed. It was a trait that had defined her since her college days, one that had both infuriated and impressed Alan all those years ago. As Alan read through the case summary, his mind kept drifting. He prided himself on impartiality, but how could he focus when the defendant was someone who had once turned his world upside down? Memories of late-night debates, heated arguments, and the grudging respect they developed for each other came flooding back. He remembered how Maya's voice would rise, not in anger, but in passion, as she dismantled his arguments piece by piece. He remembered the way she would smile, not a smug grin, but a genuine expression of triumph, when she knew she had him cornered. And now, here she was, standing before him, challenging him once again. "Miss Bennett," Alan began, his voice steady, but his hands gripping the edges of his bench. "You've chosen to contest this matter rather than pay the fine. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maya replied, her tone measured but firm. "I believe there's been an oversight in how this case was handled." Her voice was exactly as he remembered, calm, precise, and laced with an undercurrent of defiance. It was the voice of someone who wouldn't back down, someone who would fight tooth and nail for what she believed in. And that voice sent Alan straight back to those college days, to a time when he had been both inspired and infuriated by her unwavering determination. For a moment, Alan considered recusing himself from the case. It would have been the professional thing to do, the ethical choice. But something held him back. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was a lingering desire to prove, even after all these years, that he could still outmatch her. Whatever the reason, he decided to proceed. "Very well," he said, masking his emotions. "Let's review the facts." As the hearing unfolded, the courtroom became a stage for a battle of wits that felt eerily familiar to both of them. Maya presented her case with precision, citing legal precedents and procedural inconsistencies that left even the most seasoned lawyers in the room impressed. Alan, meanwhile, challenged her arguments with pointed questions, his tone professional, but his words carrying the edge of someone who was determined not to lose. The spectators watched in hushed fascination, sensing that this was no ordinary case. There was a tension between the judge and the defendant that went beyond the legal proceedings. It was a tension born of shared history, of unresolved questions, of something that neither of them was ready to confront. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Alan found himself at a crossroads. Maya's arguments were compelling, and dismissing them outright would have been a disservice to justice. But ruling in her favor would mean acknowledging that she had, once again, bested him. And that realization was as humbling as it was infuriating. But the real twist came not from the legal arguments, but from an unexpected revelation. As Alan prepared to deliver his judgment, Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but her eyes piercing. "Before you make your ruling, I'd like to submit this as evidence." Alan's gaze shifted to the folder, and his heart sank. He recognized it immediately, the college yearbook from their graduating class. Maya opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note and handed it to the court clerk, who delivered it to Alan. There, staring back at him, was a photograph of the two of them, standing side by side on the debate stage, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "It seems we've crossed paths before," Maya said, her tone almost playful. "I thought you might want to refresh your memory." The courtroom fell silent as everyone tried to make sense of the unfolding drama. Alan felt his carefully constructed composure begin to crack. This was no longer about a parking fine or procedural error. This was about something much deeper, about choices, about history, about the unresolved threads of their past. Alan closed the yearbook and set it aside, his expression unreadable. "Miss Bennett," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I'll need to review this case further before issuing a ruling." And with that, he adjourned the court, leaving everyone, including Maya, wondering what his next move would be. But as Alan stepped into his chambers, one thing was clear. This case was far from over. And whatever judgment he rendered, it would have implications far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Alan sat in his chambers, the yearbook open on his desk, the image of him and Maya staring back at him like a ghost from another life. His office was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, but his mind was anything but still. He had always prided himself on his ability to separate the personal from the professional, to remain impartial no matter the circumstances. But this was different. Maya Bennett wasn't just another defendant. She was a reminder of the person he had been, of the choices he had made and the paths he had taken, or not taken. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, allowing the memories to wash over him. College had been a whirlwind of late-night study sessions, heated debates, and relentless ambition. Alan had been driven, almost to the point of obsession, determined to carve out a future that would make his family proud. He came from a long line of lawyers and judges, and the expectations placed upon him had been immense. There was no room for distractions, no time for detours. But then there was Maya. She had been a force of nature, her intelligence and charisma drawing people to her like moths to a flame. She had a way of challenging him, of making him question his assumptions and dig deeper into his arguments. Their rivalry had been the talk of the campus, but beneath the competitive banter and intellectual sparring, there had been something else, something unspoken. Alan had always dismissed it as respect, admiration, maybe even jealousy. But now, sitting alone in his chambers, he wondered if it had been more than that. He shook his head, trying to refocus. This wasn't the time to dwell on the past. He had a case to review, evidence to consider. But the more he tried to concentrate on the legal aspects of Maya's argument, the more his mind wandered back to those college days. He remembered the first time they had faced off in a debate competition. The topic had been something mundane, municipal zoning laws, if he recalled correctly. But Maya had turned it into a masterclass in persuasion. She had spoken with such conviction, such clarity, that even he had been momentarily swayed. He had managed to counter her points and win the debate, but it had been a hollow victory. She had congratulated him afterward, a smile genuine, but her eyes had seemed to say, "Asterisk next time. I'll be ready asterisk." And she always was. Every debate, Every discussion, every chance meeting in the library or the student union, Maya had been a constant presence, a reminder that he couldn't rest on his laurels. She had pushed him to be better, to think harder, to question everything. And in doing so, she had unknowingly forced him to confront parts of himself he hadn't wanted to face. Back in the courtroom, Maya was sitting quietly at the defendant's table, her expression calm, but her mind racing. She hadn't planned to bring the yearbook into this. It had been a last-minute decision, a gamble. She had hoped it would remind Alan of their shared history, of the respect they had once had for each other. But now, as she waited for the court to reconvene, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The truth was, Maya hadn't thought about Alan Whitman in years. After college, their lives had diverged in ways neither of them could have predicted. She had gone into social work, driven by a desire to make a difference in her community. It hadn't been an easy path, far from it. She had faced countless obstacles, from systemic discrimination to personal setbacks, but she had persevered. And yet, sitting in that courtroom, staring up at the man who had once been her equal, her rival, her... what? She didn't even know anymore. All she knew was that the Alan Whitman she remembered would never have taken the easy way out, never have allowed injustice to stand unchallenged. The door to Alan's chambers opened, and his clerk entered, carrying a stack of files. "Judge Whitman," she said, her tone hesitant. "The next case is ready, but I can push it back if you need more time." Alan shook his head and closed the yearbook. "No, thank you, Susan. I'll be out in a moment." The clerk nodded and left, leaving Alan alone with his thoughts. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders and stood. Whatever lingering feelings he had about Maya, whatever unresolved questions gnawed at the edges of his mind, he couldn't let them interfere with his duties. He was a judge, and his job was to uphold the law, not to indulge in personal nostalgia. When he returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The spectators seemed more attentive, the air charged with anticipation. Alan took his seat and adjusted his glasses, glancing briefly at Maya before addressing the room. After reviewing the evidence, he began, his voice steady, but his gaze unreadable. "I believe there are additional considerations that need to be addressed. This case is not as straightforward as it initially appeared." Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp. She knew Alan well enough to recognize when he was holding something back. The question was, what? Alan continued, outlining the procedural irregularities Maya had brought to light, but his words were measured, careful. He wasn't just speaking to the courtroom. He was speaking to her, and she knew it. As the hearing dragged on, the tension between them grew, unspoken but palpable. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about everything they had left unsaid, everything they had chosen to bury. And yet, neither of them was willing to be the first to break the silence. When the session finally adjourned for the day, Alan watched as Maya gathered her things and prepared to leave. For a moment, he considered calling out to her, asking her to stay to talk. But the words caught in his throat. What would he even say? That he was sorry for how things had ended. That he wished he had been braver, more honest, more something. But before he could decide, Maya turned and met his gaze. For a brief moment, the years seemed to fall away, and they were just two people standing on the same stage, trying to make sense of a world that was infinitely more complicated than they had ever imagined. "Good night, Your Honor," she said finally, her tone polite but distant. "Good night, Miss Bennet." Alan replied, his voice softer than he intended. And with that, she was gone, leaving him alone in the courtroom, the echoes of their shared past lingering in the empty space. Alan sat back in his chair, staring at the door she had just walked through. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The evening sun was setting over the city as Maya stepped out of the courthouse, the cool breeze brushing against her face. She clutched her bag tightly, her mind swirling with thoughts she'd tried to push aside during the hearing. It wasn't just the case that had unsettled her. It was Alan. Seeing him again after all these years had stirred up memories she thought she left behind, memories she wasn't sure how to feel about. Back in college, Their rivalry had been intense but strangely grounding. Maya had always been driven, her path shaped by a deep-seated need to prove herself in a world that didn't always value voices like hers. Alan had been her equal and opposite, privileged, polished, and unwavering in his confidence. Yet, for all their differences, they had shared an unspoken understanding, a connection rooted in mutual respect. At least that's how Maya remembered it. But seeing him now, sitting on that bench, with an air of authority she couldn't ignore, she wasn't so sure. As she made her way to her car, Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out and saw a message from her younger sister Layla. "How'd it go? You taken down yet?" Maya couldn't help but smile at her sister's tone, but the question struck a nerve. Asterisk take him down, asterisk. Was that really what this was about? The case had started as a small act of defiance, a stand against what she saw as an unjust system. But now, with Alan involved, it felt personal in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She typed back a quick response, still fighting, and slipped the phone back into her bag. Across town, Alan sat in his office, staring blankly at the stack of files on his desk. He had a full docket for the week, but he couldn't focus on anything but Maya. The courtroom today had felt more like a battlefield than a place of justice. It wasn't just her arguments that had thrown him off. It was her presence, the way she carried herself with the same unshakable confidence he remembered. It was maddening, and if he was honest with himself, a little inspiring. Alan's clerk knocked on the door, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Judge Whitman, there's someone here to see you," she said cautiously. "Who is it?" Alan asked, rubbing his temples. "It's Richard Marshall," she replied, her tone dropping. "The city attorney." Alan sighed and nodded. "Sent him in." Richard was a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue. He walked into the office with a kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance, carrying a leather briefcase that looked as expensive as his watch. "Alan," he said with a smirk, "heard you've got a bit of a situation on your hands." Alan leaned back in his chair, already bracing himself for whatever Richard was about to say. "What do you want, Richard?" "Oh, nothing much," Richard said casually, setting his briefcase on the desk. "Just thought I'd offer a little advice on how to handle your latest case. The city's been keeping an eye on it, you know. Parking violations may seem small, but when someone starts questioning procedure, it can set a dangerous precedent." Alan narrowed his eyes. "Are you suggesting I rule against Miss Bennett to avoid setting a precedent?" Richard raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not suggesting anything, just pointing out the bigger picture. You've got a reputation to uphold, Alan. Don't let one defiant defendant ruin that." Alan felt a surge of irritation. "This isn't about my reputation. It's about the law." Richard chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "The law is what we make it, Alan. Don't forget that." As Richard left, Alan sat in silence, his frustration simmering. He hated the implication that his judgment could be swayed by politics or pressure. But he also couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Maya's case wasn't just about a parking violation anymore. It was becoming a symbol, a challenge to the system itself. And Alan was caught in the middle. Meanwhile, Maya was meeting with a close friend, Carla, at a small cafe near her apartment. Carla had been her sounding board for years, someone who could always help her make sense of things. But tonight, even Carla seemed unsure how to navigate the tangled web of emotions Maya was dealing with. "You're telling me the judge is asterisk Alan Whitman asterisk?" Carla asked, her eyes wide. "The same Alan Whitman who used to drive you crazy in college." "The very same," Maya said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "And he hasn't changed much, either. Still thinks he's the smartest person in the room." Carla leaned back in her chair, a mischievous smile on her face. "So what's the plan? Gonna take him down like old times?" Maya hesitated, her mind flashing back to the look on Alan's face as she handed him the yearbook. For a moment, she had seen something in his eyes, confusion, maybe even regret. It was a sign of him she hadn't expected, and it had thrown her off balance. "It's not about taking him down," Maya said finally. It's about standing up for what's right. This case might seem small, but it's part of a bigger problem. People like Alan don't understand what it's like to fight for every inch, to be dismissed and ignored just because of who you are. Carla nodded, her expression softening. And what if Alan isn't the same person you remember? What if he's changed? Maya shrugged, but the question lingered in her mind. Had Alan changed? Or had she been so focused on proving herself that she hadn't given him a chance to show who he really was? As the days passed, the case continued to gain attention. Local news outlets picked up on the story, framing it as a David and Goliath battle between a determined citizen and an unyielding system. Reporters speculated about the implications of the case, while social media buzzed with commentary. Maya found herself both encouraged and overwhelmed by the support she was receiving. But with the attention came pressure, and she knew she couldn't afford to lose. Alan, too, felt the weight of the spotlight. He spent long nights reviewing case law and rereading Maya's arguments, searching for a way to balance his duty to the law with his personal feelings. He couldn't shake the sense that this case was about more than legalities. It was about accountability, about fairness, about justice. But the closer he looked, the more complicated it became. Alan discovered that the parking violation was just the tip of the iceberg. The procedural errors Maya had pointed out were part of a broader pattern, one that suggested systemic issues within the city's enforcement practices. It wasn't just about one woman contesting a fine. It was about an entire community being unfairly targeted. And that realization left Alan with a question he wasn't sure how to answer. Was he willing to take a stand, even if it meant challenging the very system he had spent his career defending? The courtroom was packed now, the gallery filled with curious onlookers, reporters scribbling furiously, and community members who had heard whispers of something much larger brewing. Maya sat at the defendant's table, calm on the surface, but her heart pounding beneath her poised exterior. She could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, the unspoken expectations of people who were tired of being ignored. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never really had been. Alan entered the room with his usual deliberate stride, but today there was a slight tension in his posture, a heaviness in his expression that only someone watching closely would notice. He took his seat at the bench, glancing briefly at Maya before clearing his throat to begin. We'll resume proceedings in the case of Bennett v. City of Westbrook, he announced, his voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. Before we proceed, I've reviewed the additional evidence submitted by the defense and the city's response. Maya straightened in her seat. This was it. This was the moment everything could shift. She had worked tirelessly, digging into city records, uncovering a pattern of disproportionate fines and procedural inconsistencies that painted a damning picture. It wasn't just her who had been wronged. It was countless others, many of them from the same underserved neighborhoods. The implications were staggering, and she knew Alan had seen it too. As the city's attorney, Richard Marshall, rose to address the court, his tone was slick and rehearsed, oozing the confidence of someone used to winning battles through sheer force of arrogance. Your Honor, while the defense has presented a compelling narrative, the facts remain unchanged. This case is about a single parking violation. To suggest that it represents a larger systemic issue is not only baseless but irresponsible. Maya clenched her jaw, her fists tightening under the table. Richard's words were like a slap in the face, dismissing the lived experiences of her, and so many others as mere exaggerations. But she kept her composure, knowing that her chance to speak would come. Alan's gaze flickered to Maya for the briefest of moments before he addressed Richard. Mr. Marshall, the defense has provided evidence that suggests a pattern of enforcement practices that disproportionately affects specific communities. Are you prepared to dispute those claims with factual data? Richard hesitated, the confident smirk faltering for just a second before returning. Your Honor, the burden of proof lies with the defense. If they wish to make sweeping allegations, they must substantiate them beyond anecdotal evidence. Alan leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level that commanded attention. That's not an answer to my question, Mr. Marshall. Do you have data that refutes the defense's evidence? The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Richard shuffled his papers, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. "At this time, we do not have that data available, Your Honor," he admitted reluctantly. Maya felt a surge of satisfaction, but she quickly pushed it down. This wasn't about scoring points. It was about exposing the truth, and there was still so much at stake. When it was her turn to speak, she rose with a calm determination that belied the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "Your Honor, this case is about more than a parking ticket. It's about accountability. It's about a system that has for too long operated without transparency or fairness. The evidence I've provided isn't just a collection of isolated incidents. It's a pattern. A pattern that disproportionately impacts people like me, people who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back." Her voice carried across the room, steady and resolute, and for the first time, Alan allowed himself to truly see her, not as a defendant, not as his former rival, but as a person standing up against a system she believed was broken. He had always admired her courage, her refusal to back down, and now that same fire was forcing him to confront truths he had long avoided. As Maya finished her statement, Alan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The evidence she had presented was damning, but the implications of ruling in her favor were monumental. It wasn't just about this case. It was about setting a precedent, about challenging a system that he had been a part of for years. And yet, the alternative felt even more untenable. To dismiss her claims would be to ignore the truth, to perpetuate an injustice he could no longer deny. The court adjourned for the day, and as the spectators filed out, the tension in the room lingered like a thick fog. Maya stayed behind, gathering her papers and preparing to leave when she heard Alan's voice. "Miss Bennet, may I have a word?" She turned to face him, her expression guarded but curious. "Of course, Your Honor." Alan stepped down from the bench, his usual air of authority replaced by something more human, more vulnerable. "This isn't easy for either of us," he began, his voice low. "But I want you to know that I'm taking this seriously. More seriously than you might think." Maya studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. "I hope so," she replied. "Because for a lot of people, this isn't just about fairness. It's about survival." Alan nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "I understand that now, more than I ever did before." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the years between them seemed to fade away. They weren't a judge and a defendant, or even former rivals. They were two people grappling with the complexities of justice, trying to find a way forward in a world that often made it seem impossible. As Maya left the courtroom, Alan stood alone, the echoes of her words reverberating in his mind. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. But the hardest decisions still lay ahead, and Alan wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. The next morning, Maya woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, expecting a text from Layla or maybe Carla. Instead, her screen was flooded with notifications, emails, missed calls, and social media alerts. Confused, she sat up, scrolling through the messages until one headline caught her eye. Asterisk, asterisk, Judge Alan Whitman's past under scrutiny amid high-stakes court case. Asterisk, asterisk. Her heart sank as she clicked on the article. It was from a local news outlet, one that had been covering her case extensively. The story detailed accusations against Alan, suggesting that during his early career as a prosecutor, he had turned a blind eye to questionable practices in cases involving marginalized communities. The piece implied that his history was inconsistent with the impartiality expected of a judge, questioning his ability to rule fairly in her case. Maya stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. Part of her felt vindicated. After all, she had always suspected that Alan's privilege had shielded him from understanding the struggles of people like her. Another part of her felt uneasy. She knew the media could be relentless, and while Alan might deserve scrutiny, this felt like an ambush. Meanwhile, Alan was sitting in his chambers, staring at his own screen in disbelief. The article was brutal. driving up events from years ago that he hadn't thought about in ages. Some of the accusations were exaggerated, but others were rooted in truths he couldn't deny. He had made mistakes back then, trusting the system too much, believing it would always operate justly. Now those mistakes were threatening to overshadow everything he had worked for. His clerk knocked on the door, breaking his train of thought. "Judge Whitman, the media's outside again. They're asking for a statement." Alan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Tell them no comment," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. But as the door closed, he couldn't help but wonder if silence was the right choice. The court of public opinion was unforgiving, and this case had already become a lightning rod for controversy. That evening, Maya found herself torn. She knew she needed to focus on her case, but the story about Alan had shifted the dynamic in a way she hadn't anticipated. She called Carla to talk it through, hoping her friend could help her make sense of it. "Did you see the article?" Maya asked as soon as Carla picked up. "Yeah, I saw it," Carla replied. "And honestly, it's about time someone held him accountable. But what's that mean for your case? Are you worried it'll affect his decision?" Maya hesitated. "I don't know. He's always been by the book. But now, I can't tell if he's trying to prove something, or if this will just make him dig in his heels." Carla was quiet for a moment. "You think there's any truth to it? The stuff about his past?" "I think everyone's got skeletons in their closet," Maya said finally. "That doesn't mean they shouldn't face the consequences." As Maya wrestled with her thoughts, Alan was facing his own internal battle. He spent hours combing through his old case files, revisiting decisions he hadn't thought about in years. The process was grueling, forcing him to confront moments where he had let biases, his own or others, influence the outcomes. He hated what he saw, but he couldn't ignore it. If he was going to move forward, he needed to reckon with his past. The next day in court, the atmosphere was electric. News of the article had spread, and the tension in the room was palpable. Maya watched as Alan took his seat, his expression unreadable, but his movements more deliberate than usual. She could tell he was feeling the pressure, and for the first time she wondered if this case might be too much for him. The proceedings began, and Richard Marshall wasted no time trying to capitalize on the controversy. "Your Honor, given recent revelations, I must question whether you can remain impartial in this case," he said, his tone measured but sharp. Maya's stomach twisted. She hadn't expected Richard to go there, but she couldn't say she was surprised. Still, the move felt calculated, an attempt to deflect from the city's own failings by shifting the spotlight onto Alan. Alan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "Mr. Marshall, this court operates on evidence and the law, not speculation. Unless you have a motion to file, I suggest we proceed." Richard smirked, clearly satisfied with planting the seed of doubt. "As you wish, Your Honor." The day's testimony focused on the evidence Maya had presented, with witnesses from her neighborhood testifying about their own experiences with the city's enforcement practices. The stories were heartbreaking, painting a vivid picture of a system that seemed designed to exploit the most vulnerable. Maya felt a surge of pride as each person spoke, their voices steady despite the weight of their truths. But as compelling as the testimony was, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface, something that could derail everything. She caught glimpses of Alan throughout the day, his expression shifting between focus and something that looked like guilt. It was as if he was carrying the weight of not just this case, but his entire career. As the session ended and the courtroom emptied, Maya lingered behind, watching as Alan gathered his notes. She hesitated before approaching him, unsure of what she wanted to say, but feeling the need to say something. "Judge Whitman," she began, her voice softer than she intended. He looked up, surprised to see her still there. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone cautious. I don't know what's true or not about what they're saying," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth has a way of coming out, whether we want it to or not." Alan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "The truth," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's not always as simple as we think." Maya nodded, sensing that there was more he wasn't saying. But before she could press further, the moment passed and Alan turned back to his papers. She left the courtroom with a strange mix of emotions, unsure of what the next day would bring but certain that the stakes had never been higher. The final day of the trial arrived and the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The energy in the room was electric, a palpable mix of anticipation and unease. Maya sat at the defense table, her fingers lightly drumming against her notepad. She had spent the night rehearsing her closing statements, but no amount of preparation could fully settle the butterflies in her stomach. This was it, the moment that would define not just her case, but potentially her future, and the futures of so many others. Judge Alan Whitman entered the courtroom, his presence commanding immediate silence. His usual calm seemed replaced with an undercurrent of tension, though he masked it well. He had spent the past nights grappling with his conscience, the media storm surrounding him, and the undeniable weight of the evidence Maya had presented. Today, he had to deliver a verdict, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. The city's attorney, Richard Marshall, rose to deliver his closing remarks, his tone sharp and unwavering. Your Honor, despite the defense's impassioned narrative, this case remains fundamentally about a single parking violation. The attempt to broaden it into an indictment of our city's enforcement practices is not only irrelevant but irresponsible. The law is clear, and the facts are simple. Ms. Bennett violated the regulations, and the fine is justified. Maya felt a surge of frustration, but kept her expression neutral. She had anticipated this, Richard's insistence on reducing her fight to something trivial, dismissing the systemic injustices she had worked so hard to expose. When it was her turn, Maya rose, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Your Honor, this case was never just about a parking ticket. It's about a pattern of enforcement that targets specific communities, a system that profits from the struggles of those least able to bear the burden. The evidence we've presented is clear. This isn't conjecture, it's fact. And today, you have the power to send a message that justice isn't reserved for the privileged few, but is a right for everyone. As Maya finished, the room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Alan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Finally, Alan straightened, his voice steady but laced with emotion. This court has reviewed the evidence presented by both parties. While the city argues that this case is limited to a single infraction, the defense has demonstrated a broader issue that cannot be ignored. The enforcement practices in question reveal a troubling pattern of systemic inequities that demand accountability. Maya's heart leaped as she listened, but Alan's next words sent a chill down her spine. However, he continued, his tone shifting slightly, justice requires fairness not just in addressing the past, but in ensuring the integrity of this court. Recent allegations about my prior actions have cast doubt on my ability to remain impartial. While I believe I have judged this case fairly, perception matters. Therefore, I am recusing myself from issuing a final ruling and transferring this case to a higher court. The room erupted into murmurs, the unexpected turn leaving everyone stunned. Maya stared at Alan, disbelief mingling with frustration. This wasn't the resolution she had fought for, but it wasn't a loss either. It was limbo, a place she had hoped to avoid. As the courtroom cleared, Maya approached Alan, her voice low but firm. Why now? After everything, why step back? Alan met her gaze, the wariness in his eyes unmistakable. Because justice isn't just about doing the right thing, it's about being seen as doing the right thing. If my involvement undermines the legitimacy of this case, then I've failed both of us. Maya wanted to argue, to tell him that his decision felt like a betrayal, but she saw the sincerity in his expression and knew his choice hadn't come lightly. Instead, she nodded, her frustration tempered by grudging respect. As she left the courthouse, her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a message from Layla, a link to a breaking news story. Maya clicked it, her eyes widening as she read the headline. Asterisk, whistleblower alleges decades-long corruption in city's enforcement division. Asterisk. The article detailed shocking revelations from an anonymous insider, exposing how city officials had manipulated enforcement policies to disproportionately target low-income neighborhoods while funneling profits into private accounts. The evidence aligned perfectly with the patterns Maya had uncovered, but it went even deeper, implicating officials at the highest levels. Maya's breath caught as she realized what this meant. Her case was no longer just a battle for her own justice. It was the spark for a much larger reckoning. She felt a mix of vindication and determination. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn in her favor. As the city braced for the fallout, Maya couldn't help but wonder if Alan had known about the whistleblower, if his recusal was part of a larger plan to ensure the truth came out untainted. The thought lingered as she walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the fight ahead balanced by the hope of what was to come.